When we think of failed monarchs, the list is long, but among them stands one king whose legacy is soaked in betrayal, fear, obsession, and grotesque insecurity. He was no glorious warrior, no patron of the arts, no reformer. He was a king who ruled through repression, trembled at confrontation, and left behind a kingdom in ruins. Along with something else, a bizarre relic that even today is whispered about in royal halls. There are the 20 most disturbing truths about Ferdinand VII of Spain, untold and chilling details that reveal a man so obsessed with power and masculinity, he literally tried to preserve it beyond death. First fact, he betrayed his own father to take the throne. Most royal coups are bloody. Ferdinand VII's was slimy. Even before he was king, Ferdinand was already scheming in the shadows. At just 24, he wrote secret letters to Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, the emperor who would later invade Spain, begging for help to overthrow his own father, Charles IV. He accused his father of incompetence and his mother of corruption. This wasn't just a power grab, it was personal, and the betrayal worked, briefly. In 1808, Ferdinand finally seized the throne, only to hand it over 2 months later to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, like a pawn returning to its box. Why? Because Napoleon summoned both Ferdinand and Charles to Bayonne, France, and played them like fools. Ferdinand surrendered the crown in exchange for a French pension and a chateau. While Spain burned in guerrilla warfare against French occupation, Ferdinand sipped wine in French salons. A king who begged his enemies for help and abandoned his people at their darkest hour, this was the foundation of his reign. Second fact, he was known as El Deseado until he became a tyrant. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814 after Napoleon's fall, the people cheered. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. It would become Spain's cruelest irony. Within weeks of regaining the throne, Ferdinand abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, which had promised Spain a modern democratic future. Instead, he restored absolute monarchy and unleashed one of the most savage political purges in Spanish history. Censorship crushed free thought. Political opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. Liberal generals who had fought against Napoleon were now hunted like traitors. Ferdinand ruled not with dignity, but with vengeance. His paranoia turned Spain into a nation of whispers and fear. A monarch once welcomed as a savior became the very tyrant the people had feared all along. Third fact, his obsession with masculinity became a national crisis. This is where Ferdinand's story takes a darker, stranger turn. Behind closed doors, Ferdinand wasn't just paranoid about power. He was terrified of his own body. After 3 failed marriages without children, the royal court buzzed with rumors. Was the king impotent? Was he deformed? Foreign diplomats wrote candidly in letters to their courts, the King of Spain may be physically incapable of fathering an heir. The stakes were enormous. Spain's entire future depended on Ferdinand producing a male successor. And yet, despite prayers, doctors, and whispered rituals, no children came. Satirical pamphlets in Madrid mocked him. His enemies, and some of his allies, began to believe he wasn't just a weak ruler, but not a real man at all. And for Ferdinand, that wasn't just humiliating, it was intolerable. Fourth fact, he consumed rhinoceros horn and deadly potions to prove his manhood. Ferdinand's fear of impotence didn't stay a rumor, it became an obsession. Convinced that only virility could secure his image and the throne, the king began a descent into medical madness. He summoned charlatans from across Europe, demanding they restore his manhood. Rhinoceros horn powder from Africa, elixirs made from crushed emeralds and snake venom, herbal aphrodisiacs shipped from colonies in the Americas. You name it, he drank it. Some of these concoctions were not just useless, they were deadly. The king's health began to collapse. His body swelled grotesquely. His teeth rotted from constant exposure to mercury-based tonics. Yet he insisted the treatments continue. One court physician confided in a private letter, "The king believes virility is governance. He no longer rules with law, only with ego." It was the most literal case of toxic masculinity history has ever seen. Fifth fact, He may have ordered his genitals preserved after death. This is not a joke. Multiple sources, from palace letters to private medical notes, suggest that Ferdinand VII, in the final days of his life, gave one of the strangest orders ever recorded in royal history: that after his death, his genitals be preserved in a jar of alcohol. Why? The theories vary. Some believe he wanted to silence centuries of ridicule to prove he was capable of producing heirs. Others think it was an act of madness, a last attempt to control how history would remember him. But most chilling is the possibility that it was his final desperate cry for validation. While kings before him left behind cathedrals, laws, or legacies, Ferdinand chose to leave behind anatomy. Whispers of the jar persist even today. Some claim it's hidden in a crypt beneath the royal palace of Madrid. Others say it was destroyed during the Carlist Wars. No official record confirms it, and maybe that's the point. The myth became the monument, a grotesque legacy more powerful than any crown. Sixth fact: he engineered a civil war just to control his daughters. In 1830, Ferdinand's fourth wife, his much younger niece, Maria Cristina, finally gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. 2 years later, another daughter followed. Relief swept through the palace. After decades of scandal and ridicule, the king had produced heirs. But for Spain's deeply patriarchal society, the news wasn't enough. They demanded a son, and when one didn't come, the country fractured. Ferdinand, desperate to secure Isabella's future, rewrote succession laws to allow her, a girl, to inherit the throne. It was a radical and controversial move. His brother Carlos, a devout ultra-conservative, declared it illegitimate and rallied half the country against the decision. The result? The Carlist Wars, a brutal series of civil conflicts that tore Spain apart for decades. But this wasn't just about politics. Ferdinand's paranoia infected every corner of his decision-making. He didn't just want to crown Isabella. He wanted to control her from beyond the grave. He issued secret instructions for her upbringing, dictated who she could marry, and filled her court with loyalists even before she could walk. The king, so obsessed with control, started a war just to rule from the grave. And in doing so, he doomed Spain to years of bloodshed. Seventh fact: he handed Spain to the French, then parted. While it burned, imagine this: your country is in chaos, foreign troops are invading, patriots are dying in the hills, and your king. He's sipping champagne in a French chateau, strumming a guitar for aristocratic ladies. That was Ferdinand VII in 1808. After begging Napoleon to support his coup against his father, Ferdinand ended up getting played by the French emperor like a clueless puppet. Napoleon summoned Ferdinand to Bayonne under the guise of diplomacy and stripped him of the crown. But instead of resisting or rallying his people, Ferdinand surrendered the throne willingly to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. In exchange, he got a pension and a life of luxury in France. While Spanish guerrillas fought brutal mountain wars and civilians were massacred by occupying forces, Ferdinand hosted soirees and composed love songs. His betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. He abandoned the very people who had once called him the desired one. He didn't just fail Spain, he sold it. Eighth fact: he used the church as a tool of terror. Ferdinand understood something dark. Faith can comfort, but it can also control. Upon returning to the throne in 1814, he struck a deal with the reactionary clergy of Spain. In exchange for unlimited authority, he gave the church unprecedented power to suppress opposition. The result? A reign of holy terror. He restored the Inquisition. Priests now worked as informants. Sermons were used to shame liberals and justify torture. Religious confession, once sacred, became a spy network. If you spoke against the king in private, your priest might denounce you to royal agents. Even children were taught to report godless behavior, meaning liberal ideas or criticism of the crown. One historian wrote, "In Ferdinand's Spain, the pulpit and the gallows stood side by side. Religious processions became propaganda parades. Public executions were timed to coincide with feast days. God was no longer mercy, he was the king's enforcer." Ninth fact, he turned Spain into a nation of spies and fear. While Elizabeth had built an elite spy network to protect England from foreign threats, Ferdinand VII built one to protect himself from his own people. Obsessed with rumors of conspiracies and plots, he expanded his secret police into every town and province. No one was safe. Mothers feared their sons, servants feared their employers. A careless joke about the king could land you in prison. Or worse, Ferdinand's agents posed as merchants, clergy, tutors, anyone. They filled black books with the names of suspected liberals, and arrests happened in the dead of night. No trials, no explanations, just disappearance. One account describes how a nobleman, overheard complaining about bread prices, was dragged from his dinner table and never seen again. The regime didn't need evidence, it needed silence. Ferdinand ruled not with love, not even with fear, but with paranoia. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted the absence of thought. 10th fact, he humiliated his dead wives, even after their death. Ferdinand VII was married 4 times. 3 of his wives died without producing an heir, and while the public mourned, the king's private actions were deeply unsettling. Behind the palace curtains, Ferdinand reportedly mocked his deceased wives, not just in crude jokes, but in disturbing rituals. Palace servants whispered of a chamber where portraits of his dead queens were kept. But these weren't tributes, they were taunts. One story describes a banquet where he ordered the portraits placed around the table and toasted to their failures. He reportedly called his second wife the barren saint and forced courtiers to laugh. But it got worse. After the death of his third wife, Maria Josepha of Saxony, who had suffered 7 years of miscarriages and illness, Ferdinand refused to hold a public funeral. Instead, he demanded a private medical examination of her body, allegedly to find out whether she had ever really been capable of childbirth. The findings? Never made public. The violation? Very real. 11th fact, his court was a circus of cruelty and perversion. While Spain starved and rebelled, the royal court of Ferdinand VII became something else entirely. A grotesque carnival of power games, superstition, and debauchery. The king, now bloated and often unable to walk from illness, turned the palace into his own theatre of dominance. He surrounded himself with sycophants, jesters, and healers who offered bizarre treatments. One account describes Ferdinand crawling across the marble floors on all fours, barking like a dog for entertainment. Another speaks of him demanding that courtiers wear masks during dinner, so he could test their loyalty by guessing who was who. But the most twisted were his punishments. A chamberlain who dared contradict him at court was ordered to stand barefoot in freezing water for hours while the king watched from his throne, sipping wine. Rumors swirled that some courtiers disappeared after private audiences. Officially, they'd retired. Unofficially, no one dared ask. 12th fact, he became a posthumous joke. Across all of Europe, Ferdinand died in 1833, but his humiliation didn't end with his life. Across Europe, his name became a punchline. In France, satirical newspapers ran cartoons of him holding a giant glass jar between his legs, labeled his only lasting legacy. In Britain, pamphlets portrayed him as a weeping man in royal robes, asking, "Am I not king enough?" The legend of the preserved genitals spread like wildfire. No official record confirmed it, of course, but that was the beauty of it. It didn't need confirmation. It needed belief. It was the perfect symbol of a man who spent his life trying to prove he was powerful, masculine, immortal, and in doing so became a grotesque myth. Even within Spain, historians struggled with how to portray him. His official portraits showed him with sword and crown, but textbooks glossed over his failures. Meanwhile, the people remembered the truth. A coward in silk, a tyrant obsessed with his image, a king who left behind no victory, no vision, just a nation in ruins and a rumor in a jar. 13th fact, his death triggered a war that tore Spain apart. Ferdinand VII finally died in 1833, bloated, barely conscious, and still mumbling about his legacy. But his death didn't bring Spain peace, it ignited chaos. Because Ferdinand, in his obsession with control, had rewritten centuries-old laws of succession just to make sure his daughter Isabella could inherit the throne. But not everyone accepted a girl as queen. His younger brother, Don Carlos, furious and ultra-conservative, declared himself the rightful king, insisting Spain must be ruled by a male. The result, the First Carlist War, a bloody, grinding civil war that devastated Spain for 7 years. Entire villages were burned, thousands died, families were torn apart, all because one man couldn't bear the idea of a woman replacing him. And it didn't stop there. The Carlist Wars would continue in waves for nearly a century. Ferdinand may have died, but the fire he lit burned long after. His inability to secure a clean line of succession wasn't just a political error, it was a catastrophic national wound. He ruled from the grave, not with authority, but with chaos. 14th fact, he left behind a monarchy, built on lies and ghosts. After Ferdinand's death, his daughter Isabella II was crowned at the age of 3. A toddler queen in a country on the brink. But the question never stopped haunting the court. Were Isabella and her sister even truly Ferdinand's children? Rumors persisted that Queen Maria Cristina, his 4th wife and niece, had conceived with a lover. That perhaps, in desperation, medicine or deception had created heirs through artificial means. There were even whispers of swapped embryos and foreign intervention. No proof. Just enough silence to let suspicion thrive. For a king who had obsessed over virility, legitimacy, and legacy, the irony was brutal. His daughter's claim to the throne was doubted from the start. The dynasty he believed he'd rescued was now riddled with questions. The Bourbons survived, but under a cloud of mistrust that Ferdinand himself had summoned. 15th fact, he became a cautionary tale, not a national hero. In the years that followed, Spain tried to forget Ferdinand VII. Streets weren't named after him, statues were rare, history books quietly skipped over his reign. He wasn't a conqueror, he wasn't a reformer, he was an embarrassment. Among monarchists, he was referred to in hushed tones, as if speaking his name might summon his ghost. Among liberals, he was mocked as the ultimate failure. The king who ruled by fear, fought no wars, inspired no loyalty, and still managed to destroy the country. And among common people, the legend of the jar took on a life of its own. Even in death, Ferdinand couldn't escape being the butt of the joke. In aristocratic salons, nobles would toast sarcastically to the last true man of Spain, and everyone knew what they meant. In foreign courts, his name became shorthand for monarchs who couldn't rule and couldn't reproduce. He wanted immortality. He got infamy. 16th fact, he became Europe's favorite punchline. After his death, Ferdinand VII became more famous than ever, but not in the way he wanted. In salons from Paris to Vienna, he was mocked as the model of failed masculinity. Caricaturists had a field day. He was drawn as a weeping king, holding a baby doll, or worse, holding a jar labeled his last achievement. In London, satirical journals depicted him kneeling before a mirror, whispering, "Am I still a man?" For foreign powers, Ferdinand was the perfect symbol of Spain's decline. Bloated, paranoid, irrelevant. Even liberal Spanish exiles in Paris began writing thinly veiled novels and plays, portraying a grotesque monarch obsessed with sex, shame, and power. Though names were changed, everyone knew who they meant. What stung the most? These portrayals weren't all exaggeration. They reflected real fears, fears Ferdinand had planted himself, and now he was immortalized not in marble, but in mockery. His legacy, carefully constructed out of repression and denial, crumbled the second it left the palace gates. 17th fact, his paranoia became a blueprint for dictators. Ferdinand didn't invent political fear, but he perfected it. His system of secret informants, his manipulation of religion, his obsession with controlling not just actions but thoughts, all became tools later reused by others. Future Spanish leaders, from generals to regents, quietly adopted Ferdinand's tactics, just under new names. Even Franco's 20th century dictatorship borrowed heavily from the mechanisms Ferdinand built. Centralized surveillance, state religion as enforcement, national myth as propaganda. In this way, Ferdinand's poison outlived him. He may not have been a powerful king, but he was a powerful example of what not to be, and yet what could be horribly effective. He showed that you could destroy a nation slowly, not with a sword, but with fear and ego, and many took note. 18th fact: his true legacy was a kingdom that couldn't heal. When Ferdinand died, Spain was not liberated, it was shattered. The Carlist wars were just beginning. The monarchy was fragile. The people were exhausted. But perhaps the worst damage wasn't visible. It was psychological. He left behind a Spain that didn't trust itself. A country afraid of reform, afraid of modernity, afraid of its own history. Liberals and conservatives alike couldn't agree whether to forget him or confront him. For generations, his name remained taboo in schools and parliaments. He was not taught as a hero or a villain, but simply omitted. And yet, his ghost lingered. Every time Spain stumbled into another political crisis, Ferdinand's legacy flickered in the background, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when a ruler puts personal insecurity above national interest. He didn't just haunt the palace, he haunted the future. 19th fact: his most lasting monument may be floating in a jar. The story sounds impossible, absurd, even obscene, and yet it's whispered with such consistency, such solemnity, that dismissing it entirely seems dishonest. That after his death, King Ferdinand VII ordered his genitals to be preserved. Not his crown, not his sword, not even his heart. Why? To prove, at last, that he was a man. There's no official record, no royal inventory lists the jar. No plaque marks its location, but servants passed down the tale. Foreign diplomats mentioned it in coded letters. A few even claimed to have seen it, sealed in glass, floating in alcohol, hidden beneath the royal palace of Madrid in a crypt with other forgotten relics. Whether the jar is real or not barely matters anymore. The legend is stronger than any document. It is the document. 20th fact: he died terrified, not of God or judgment, but of mockery. In his final weeks, Ferdinand was no longer a king. He was a ruin. Racked with gout, diabetes, kidney failure and delusion, he lay bedridden, bloated and trembling. But even then, with death pressing on his chest, he didn't ask about the nation. He didn't call for priests. He didn't reflect. He asked his doctors, "Do they still doubt me?" He demanded more potions, more elixirs. He clutched at the covers and mumbled about heirs, as if repeating it enough could change the past. His court, silent and exhausted, watched a man consumed not by fear of hell or punishment, but of being remembered as a joke. And that, tragically, is exactly what happened. And now, bonus fact for you: he was the king who tried to be remembered and couldn't be forgotten. Ferdinand VII wanted to be a titan, a patriarch, a monarch whose power echoed across centuries. Instead, he became a grotesque myth. He left no golden age, no victorious wars, no brilliant reforms. He left Spain bleeding, fractured, and ashamed. But he did leave something else, a nation that learned, painfully, what happens when ego replaces leadership, when masculinity becomes policy, and when fear rules instead of wisdom. And perhaps he left a jar, sealed, silent, suspended beneath the palace, a final floating monument to insecurity, paranoia, and the most human of all royal tragedies, the terror of being forgotten. So what do you think of King Ferdinand VII now? A tragic figure or a tyrant, a victim of his time or its greatest mistake? Whether you see him as a paranoid fool or a misunderstood monarch, one thing is certain: his story is unlike any other in European history, not because of what he built, but because of what he feared most and what he may have left behind. Forever.